So Anja and I today are going to talk about data on the margins, looking at data from LGBTIQ plus populations in European social science data archives. And we will start by um, saying a few words about who we are. So I am Jonas. I use he, him pronouns, and I've been working at GESIS since 2012, so a shockingly long time. And in my day-to-day job, I'm responsible for digital preservation, planning it, documenting it, achieving certification for our data archive. And my research interests are in data curation and preservation, but also very strongly in data justice topics. So, for example, looking at, how is research conducted about marginalized populations?
And hello, my name is Anja. I go by she or her. I also joined GESIS in 2012, but in a different department. And in 2016, I moved to the same department as Jonas is in. That's called the Data Services for the Social Sciences. There I work in research data management, and that means I consult research projects on research data management and data sharing, and I also provide trainings in these topics. My research interests are in data management, for example, the motivation to share data, what it means and what effort it means in doing good data management and data sharing, and also data feminism. And today's topic is a data feminism topic. We talk about the LGBTIQ plus data gap. And a data gap means that data is missing about a minoritized or disenfranchised group. And a very prominent example is the gender data gap. I think many people have heard about it. One example would be that in Europe, we don't have crash tests with dummies that are modeled after the female body. So we know very little about the effect that car crashes have on women compared to men. And this is known and it's criticized, but not much has changed in the EU since then. We are talking about the LGBTIQ plus group today, and data gaps often occur due to unequal power relations, which is also true for this group. That means that the majority group is the dominant group usually in a society. For us, it's typically white men, heterosexual men that are most often in power, in politics, in administration, and in the business world, and they make the decisions. Often they are not aware that this data is missing, or that there's a demand for this data, that a minoritized group may have different demands or different needs, and so they are not aware that this data is needed. A lot of times it's also due to political resistance, because more data on other groups might challenge the status quo, but the majority group profits from the status quo because they are successful in the status quo and they don't want to challenge this. Especially for LGBTIQ+, there's often stigma and discrimination involved. In our country, in our society, we can talk about these topics easily now, but I think many of us still remember a time when that wasn't the case. And there are parts of our society where this is still not the case. And there are other countries that are also lagging behind, and where queerness is still stigmatized or even criminalized, which is the last bullet point. And that makes it even harder to come out and talk about it openly and identify openly to belong to this group. One example that makes clear what effect such a gap can have on LGBTIQ is the COVID pandemic. And there's data for the US that showed that queer people were more affected by the pandemic. They were in jobs, in branches and employment situations that couldn't continue working, and so they were in a higher danger to lose their job and become poor, which had an effect on their mental health. And also, queer people tend to not go to the doctor's office as often because of the stigma that is still involved in some cases. And that's why they may not have known about underlying conditions that made them more vulnerable to this disease. And so they were more affected physically even by this pandemic. But society had very little knowledge about it because nobody really looked into the kinds of jobs that LGBTIQ groups tend to work in. So they didn't know that they were more in danger, and so society didn't have any means to help this group properly. We want to tackle this and want to research this data gap, and the first step, and this is what we're going to present here today, is that we thought we need an inventory of the data available. And as a basis, we used European Social Science Data Archives. GESIS is one of these archives, and we are in a large network, a European network, which is called CESSDA. And so every partner or member country of CESSDA has a central social science data archive. And a total, we have 34 data archives in Europe, and we looked at each data catalog and researched whether they have data sets with LGBTIQ plus samples. And what does it mean? It doesn't mean like a general population survey with a question, do you identify as one of the aspects of LGBTIQ plus? We really wanted to find data that was specifically targeted to this group because we wanted to see whether there's data available that can really make sense of the way of life of this group, their challenges, etc. And we found 66 archives in 66 data sets in 9 out of the 34 archives. 65 data sets include data on sexual orientation, 20 data sets include data on gender identity, and 6 data sets include the presence of intersex variations in the respondents. 48 data sets only surveyed the LGBTI plus groups, and 18 data sets also include the majority group. And this could be members of the majority group reporting about LGBTIQ plus persons, for example, caregivers. The majority group could also be used as a contrast to the LGBTI plus group that was researched, or we also included studies that did an oversample of LGBTIQ plus persons. 4 data sets cover more than one country, and 15 data sets cover a longer time span of more than 1 decade. And when we look at the spatial coverage and gaps, here is the map of Europe that shows you how the data on sexual orientation covers Europe, the European countries, and we can see that the majority of countries is covered. We don't have a lot of data. 66 is not a large number, but it covers quite a large area of Europe. The Balkan countries, some of the Balkan countries are missing, Ukraine and Iceland. When it comes to gender identity, the coverage of countries is the same, except the map becomes a bit paler, so fewer data sets are available in each country. When it comes to intersex traits, there's just one data set for the majority of countries. Only Finland has a total of 5 data sets on intersex traits. And with that, I want to point you to one very important data set. That's the EU LGBTI survey. It's conducted by the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. And 2 waves exist so far, and that is one from 2012, the EU LGBT survey. So they don't cover the intersex aspect yet, and that wave is stored at the UKDA, our partner archive in the United Kingdom. And the second wave is from 2019. That one includes the intersex aspect, and it is stored with us at GESIS. And right now we are working on getting the third wave in. So this one from 2023 will be available soon. It's a non-probability sample. That means there are no sample frames. It's also not possible to use sample frames because LGBTI is not a marker that can be used for a sample frame. But they do a lot of work to reach out to their target population. They go through LGBTI organization in each country. They use social media, dating apps, etc. And if you want to read more about it, they have a very good technical report where they describe their method, and they're very successful. For almost every country, they actually exceed their target number. So it's a very good database to study LGBTIQ in Europe. The questions of the data set are about discrimination, violence, and harassment in different areas of life. So as an example, also discrimination on the housing market, or questions such as, I can hold hands with my partner in public life. And as a reminder, this was the Europe map with all the data sets that we found. If we leave out the EU, the two waves of the EU survey, we end up with this map. So this shows you how important this EU study is. It's for many countries, it's the only data source on LGBTI that they have. Now, if we only look at intersex traits, that shrinks even further than if we leave out the EU study, then we only end up with Finland having a few studies available on intersex traits. And for no other countries we have the data available. Then I also want to talk a bit about temporal coverage to guide you and to read this graph better. I want to start out by explaining that on the left side, so the y-axis, you have the start decade, and then when the square extends further to the right, that means that one data set covers more than the start decade. So for example, in the first line, there's one study that starts coverage in 1920s, and then it goes on and covers further decades until the 1940s. And what we can see is that there are two clusters. We have studies covering the very early years, the 20s until the 40s. And these are data that are collected retrospectively. So they are, for example, statistics about heterosexual prisoners in the German concentration camps, but also interviews of how life was as homosexual, during the World War, where they could go and meet other homosexual men, for example. Then there's a large gap. These data, these very early data, they are available for Germany, the Netherlands, and Finland. And then there's a larger gap, and then it starts again in the 80s and very prominently in the UK, but also other countries join this and collect more data, and then the data is collected at an increasing rate, and in the 2000s and 2010s, we have about 16, 17 studies that cover or that land in each decade. Also, when we look at this data, we must be aware that probably more data is collected nowadays because it's a topic that is interesting for our society. We talk about it more, but also data sharing became more popular or more even demanded in the 2000 and 2010, and this is why we also have the data available in the archives. And with that, I'll pass on to Jonas.
Excellent. Thank you, Anja. Yeah, so I'm going to take you through some steps that we took in order to get a better idea of which topics were covered by the data that we looked at. So the topics that were covered and were not covered, so both sides. And in order to get a better idea of this without having to look in detail into all of the study documentation for each of the data sets we found, we decided that as a first step to sort of approximate or approach this topic, we would look at the keywords assigned to each of the data sets by the hosting archive. So of the 66 data sets that we found, 65 had keywords assigned to them. And all in all, there were 970 individual keywords assigned to these 65 studies. And these keywords basically they were very heterogeneous. They came from different controlled vocabularies. Sometimes they were, I think, just, freely assigned. So we decided, in order to get a better idea of the topics that are and are not covered, we would, in a first step, map those keywords onto another controlled vocabulary, and we selected the CESSDA topic classification for this purpose. This is a typology offered by CESSDA, the Consortium of European Social Science Data Archives, and it's like I said, it's a controlled vocabulary which presents a typology of main themes or subjects of social science data. And the CESSDA topic classification consists of 19 broader topic categories. And each of these topic categories has up to 12 subcategories assigned to them. And when we did our mapping, we realized that some subcategories were missing. So we decided to add a few subcategories in addition to the ones that already were in the topic classification. So for example, we added a subcategory for ethnic groups, for identity, also, for example, for sexuality and sexual identity. And next slide, please. And so when we look at how the keywords are distributed over the different categories of the CESSDA topic classification. So on the y-axis, what you see are the main topics contained in the CESSDA topic classification, and you can see that there are a number of spikes there. So one spike is right in the bottom for the category other, which we did not look at in more detail, but you can see that we have 3 additional spikes. So the category health, the category social stratification and groupings, and the category society and culture were those 3 categories which had most of the keywords in them. And you can see the percentage of all keywords indicated next to the bars. So to remind you, we had 970 keywords overall. And for example, 34% of these are in the category social stratification and groupings. I also added percentage boxes next to some of the categories where somehow we had expected for there to be more or better coverage, and where we were a bit surprised that not more studies or not more keywords fell into these categories. So for example, economics is only 2.9% of all keywords, psychology only 0.2%, and social welfare policy and systems also at only 0.7%. And next slide, please. Okay, so first by looking at these overall distribution in the main categories, we were able to see, which topics were very strongly represented and which weren't so strongly represented. And then in the next step, we decided to basically look one step one level further down. So for the 3 categories that were very strongly represented, we then decided to look at how the keywords assigned to the studies were distributed over the subcategories contained in these main categories. So when we look at the category health, then this is used for data that covers all kinds of aspects about mental and physical health, including policy aspects. So it covers specific diseases, medical conditions, and medical treatment. And when we looked at the population, LGBTIQ plus population and social justice, then we know that mental and reproductive health are two topics that are very important with regard to um, this population. But still, like when we looked at the keywords of the studies that we found, then we found that only 1% of all keywords relate to reproductive health, and only 2% of all keywords relate to mental health. So these two topics are very, very only very marginally represented in the data that we found. And of course, there's a caveat which goes for the topic analysis and also for our overall analysis. We know, of course, that the social science data archives don't hold all the data about these populations. So we have to keep in mind that our results that we present here are valid for social science data held in European social science data archives, but we know that, data might be held in repositories that have another disciplinary background. So especially for, mental health, we would imagine, okay, maybe in psychology repositories. And we also know that a lot of data is held in community organizations and by community initiatives and is not widely shared. So this is something we have to keep in mind when looking at our analysis. And then I'm going to move on to the next category, which is social stratification and groupings. And that category in the CESSDA topic classification contains subtopics, subcategories dealing with different population groups. So segregated, for example, based on age, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, etc. And in this category, we also find the subcategory equality, inequality, and social exclusion. And so what's interesting about this category and something we were quite happy to see, so many keywords in this is that data falling into this topic category potentially allows us to research intersecting dimensions of LGBTIQ identity. So, for example, it would allow us to study the experience of disabled LGBTIQ persons, or it would allow us to study the intersection between ethnic identity and gender identity or sexuality, for example. However, what we found was that there in this category we did find some gaps. So for example, there's no study that had any keywords linking it to the subcategory elderly. So and it seems that there is not much data out there in these archives that would allow us to study the experience of older LGBTIQ plus people. We had relatively few keywords for the subcategories migration, youth, and ethnic groups. And again, these are three very vulnerable, marginalized groups, and we don't seem to have a lot of information about them in these data. And yeah, only a single data set used a keyword relating to disability. So that was also something that we thought was a very striking gap. And the last category that we looked at is society and culture. And this category includes subcategories, which it allow us to express something about how LGBTIQ plus individuals are connected with and embedded in society. So the cut subcategories here have to do with community, with values and attitudes, social behavior, but also with activities and the quality of life. And what we found was that most of the keywords assigned to the data sets that we found were in the subcategory social behavior and attitudes and religion and values. There were very few keywords in the subcategory social change, and somehow, yeah, I don't know. I think I would have expected there to be more data dealing with social change, seeing that it's so important to how LGBTIQ plus people, yeah, are perceived and also how they live their life. And another observation that we made is that the majority of studies in this category used keywords from used keywords in combination with negatively connoted terms. So there might be a keyword from, social behavior and attitudes in combination with discrimination or in combination with prejudice or bullying. So we are assuming that the data especially looks at negative experience or transports negative experience. This is an assumption that we have that we will have to have a look into, but it's something that was very striking to see that, everything basically or many keywords were combined with something that had a negative connotation. Okay. So to conclude, one takeaway was that from what we did from our project was that, yeah, there is very little overall very little LGBTIQ plus data available in European social science data archives. And for reference, this is expressed in the illustrations on this slide. So it is assumed that worldwide 11% of the population are lesbian, gay, and or bisexual. But the data that we found was only 0.145% of the data held by the European data archives we looked at. So we have a very, very, very small percentage of data available in European social science data archives about these populations. As Anja has shown, the data gap for intersex people is especially large. We also have large gaps when we look at the geographical distribution of coverage. So we have spatial gaps in Europe, and we have a temporal gap between the 1950s and 1970s. When we look at the topics again, then we found that using our method, which, as I said, has its caveats, but what we found is that topics that were relevant to doing intersectional research are scarce. So elderly and disabled LGBTIQ plus people, for example, there doesn't seem to be a lot of data about them. And if we look again at the main categories, we were maybe not surprised, but we found that economics and social welfare policy and systems were two of the categories that had very, very little data. And this also means that the European social science data archives hold very little data that would allow us to learn more about the economic situation of LGBTIQ plus people. And as Anja already said, this is, something that basically also came to play in the pandemic. And it's just that it shows that this is a very important area that we don't seem to have, easy access to data in. And we would like to encourage you to have a look at our paper. We published a data paper in the Code Data Science Journal, and we also published our data, of course. So if you're interested in looking at either, we would like to encourage you to do that. And we also have a few next steps in mind, and in order to, hone in more deeply into this topic. So we are very interested in finding out which demographic information was collected in the identified studies. And in particular, I mean, one of these topics that's really interesting is, for example, how was gender documented, recorded, or the presence or absence of intersex traits. Another topic that we are very interested in is the question of deficit or damage-centered research versus research that is empowering and that has like a holistic approach to the LGBTIQ plus lived experience. And one topic that we would also be very interested in is to learn more about what LGBTIQ plus persons who have given their data to research or are considering doing that, what are their expectations concerning data access and reuse? Because this is something we haven't really delved into in this talk, but there are a lot of ethical considerations that we have to keep in mind when thinking about, exposing this data, making it more visible, which is in a way what Anja and I are doing. And we would, yeah, really like to be able to discuss this with members of this community. And with that, we close.